Hello, we welcome you to the Bible class today. We're studying the book of Job. If you will, turn in your Bibles to Job chapter 3. We'll be looking at the chapter verse by verse today. Job chapter 3 and verses 1 to 10. Job cursed his birth. As we look at Job, we might divide the book into an outline as follows. The prologue in chapter 1 to 2, the dialogue in chapter 3 to chapter 42 and verse 6, and number 3, the epilogue in chapter 42 and verse 7 to verse 17. We've already looked at the prologue where we've noted the trials faced by Job. And today we'll begin by looking at the dialogue, beginning with Job's speech. As we study in additional lessons, we'll see Job's three friends. There are about 3 rounds of these discussions of 3 of Job's friends, followed by a man by the name of Elihu and the Lord himself. And so we'll begin today by looking at Job chapter 3, verses 1 to 10. Verse 1. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And so here in verse 1, we see that after a time of silence, as we studied last time, with Job's friends not saying a word to him, back in Job 2 and 13, Job broke the silence. He opened his mouth. In his great grief, he cursed the day of his birth. Job 3, 1 to 26, as we'll study today. He despised the day and wished that he had never been born. Note that despite his grief and his confusion, Job did not curse God, as was tempted by the devil. In this chapter, he vents his feelings. He shares his suffering, what he's going through. He says some things that he wouldn't say otherwise, if not in such pain and grief. And yet he does not curse God. He maintains his integrity and perseveres, practices patience. Verse 1, we see that he opened his mouth. He broke the silence. Verse 2, and Job spoke and said. And so here in this short passage, we see the introduction to what follows, his discussion of his feelings. Job answered the time of silence in his grief by what follows. In this chapter, Job expresses his feelings of wishing that he'd never been born. The message of the chapter is expressed in Hebrew poetry, often finding parallels, one part of the passage helping to explain the other. In this verse, Job begins to curse the day of his birth. We've already noted some of the suffering from the previous chapters of Job. He lost his property, he lost his family, and he lost his health. And now he speaks. Verse 3, may the day perish on which I was born, and the night in which it was said, a male child is conceived. The day of one's birth is typically celebrated. The announcement of the birth of a child is a joyous occasion. However, Job, in his great grief, cursed his birth, saying, may the day I was born perish, and may the night I was conceived perish. Verse 4, may that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor the light shine upon it. We see that he wished that day was darkness, that his birth had never happened. He wished that God did not care to make it happen. He wished that his birth never saw the light of day. Verse 5. May darkness and the shadow of death claim it. May a cloud settle on it. May the darkness of the day terrify it. He wished that darkness would claim the day of his birth. Instead of life, he wished that there was death. Verse 6. As for that night, may darkness seize it. May it not rejoice among the days of the year. May it not come into the number of the months. As for the night he was conceived, he wished darkness would seize it, take it. He wished that it never happened at all, that it was not even on the calendar to be able to be celebrated. Verse 7. Oh, may that day be barren. May no joyful shout come into it. He wishes that the night was barren, childless. He wishes he was never conceived and that there had never been the shout of joy at his birth. Verse 8. May those curse it who curse the day. May those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. Job wanted those who, quote, curse the day to curse the night he was conceived, and that he was never born. This may refer to those experts whose business it is to curse. Some might even claim to be able to arouse a Leviathan who is dormant. Job 41 and verse 10. In Job 41, we see a lengthy chapter discussing the creation and the creature of Leviathan. Job 41:10, it says, no one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? And so he talks about himself and his glory as creator and his creation, and that as great as this creature is, that he is greater. Here in this particular passage, it appears that he's calling for those who make it their business to curse the day itself. Even those who are able or claim to be able to arouse Leviathan. Very briefly, this term Leviathan, let's note a few passages. And of course, as we get to the later chapter, we'll study more about this particular creature. In the book of Job, the Lord spoke of the Leviathan of his creation. Job 41, verse 1 and following. A man by the name of Asaph in the book of Psalms, Psalm 74 and verses 13 to 14, he praised the Lord, identifying Leviathan as the sea creature or sea serpents, sea creatures. Psalm 74:13, you divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke the heads of the Leviathan in pieces and gave him as food to the people inhabiting the wilderness. And so according to that psalmist, the Leviathan is referring to these sea serpents in the waters. Also in Psalm 104 and 24 to 26, the psalmist praised the works of the Lord, such as the Leviathan that play in the sea. Psalm 104:24, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your possessions. This great and wide sea, in which are innumerable teeming things, living things, both small and great. There the ships sail about. There is that Leviathan, which you have made to play there. And finally, in Isaiah 27:1, the prophet described Leviathan as a serpent and as the reptile that is in the sea. He said, in that day, the Lord with his severe sword, great and strong, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, that twisted serpent, and he will slay the reptile that is in the sea. And so we have an idea of the biblical usage of this term Leviathan. Here in this particular passage, basically the idea is that Job is calling for curse upon even the day of his birth. He wished he was never born. And he calls for those who make it their business to curse, such as a prophet, to curse the day of his birth. Even those who are ready to arouse Leviathan. And as we noted, to do so was a tremendous thing, Job 41:10. And so let's go on. Verse 9, he says, may the stars of its morning be dark. May it look for light, but have none, and not see the dawning of the day. Concerning his birth, he wished that the stars of the night morning were dark, which would remain dark, and that his birth never saw the light or dawning of the day. In the book of Job, this term translated morning is also rendered as dawn and twilight. Job 7:4 and Job 24:15. Here in this particular passage, he's basically saying that he wished that the stars of the night's morning would remain dark, that they would never dawn, that they would never rise, that his birth would never see the light of the dawning of the day. Verse 10, because it did not shut up the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide sorrow from my eyes. Job gives the reason for him cursing the night. The night did not shut up the doors of his mother's womb. If that night was barren, then his eyes would see no sorrow. Job 3:1. So in verses 1-10, Job curses his birth. And given his great grief and suffering, the great tragedies that have befallen him, one might understand why he would do so. However, cursing his birth would not change the fact that he was born. He was still born, and he was going through this time of suffering. Second, we see how Job asks some why questions. Many who have suffered in life have asked the question, why? Why me? Job 3 in verse 11, he said, why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came from the womb? Job was born, and he could not change that fact of his birth. However, Job begins to ask a series of questions concerning himself. First, he asks why he did not die immediately after he was born. To die at birth is parallel with perish when I came from the womb. And like I mentioned with Hebrew poetry, as in this book, often you'll see the second part of the passage helping to explain the first. Verse 12. Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? Second, he asked why he was held and nursed. He mentioned his mother earlier. And so why did the knees receive me? Are these the knees of his father? Are these the knees of his mother? Why did the knees receive me? I think in the context here, particularly of the second part of the passage, he's talking of his mother. Why did the knees of his mother receive him? Why did she hold him on her lap? And why did she nurse him? Why did she give him milk? and so care for him. Verse 13. For now I would have lain still and been quiet. I would have been asleep. Then I would have been at rest. And so he says these words out of his great grief, out of a place of pain. He imagines that he would have, if he would have died at birth, he would be laying down to rest. The death of the body is pictured as being still, quiet, asleep, and at rest. This is true from the perspective of the world, from what the world sees. Verse 14. With kings and counselors of the earth who built ruins for themselves. He describes those who have died. He imagines being at rest with the kings and the counselors of the kings of the earth. These kings built ruins for themselves. Now, a little explanation on this. We know, of course, that the kings did not literally build ruins. It may be that they built upon ruins or that they rebuilt ruins. However, I think it's more likely that they built places for themselves that are now lying in ruins. So Job looks at people before him, kings and counselors of the earth, who have died, who are asleep, at rest. Kings, perhaps, who built cities or buildings for themselves, which are now lying in ruin. Verse 14. Now, verse 15, he says, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. The operative word, had gold. They did not take the gold with them. They did not take the silver with them to life beyond this world. He pictures himself at being at rest with princes. During their lives, they had worked for gold and had filled their houses with silver. However, they were now at rest. Verse 16. Or why was I not hidden like a stillborn child, like infants who never saw light? He thinks of a stillborn child who is hidden or buried. If he had died at birth, he imagines that if he never saw the light of day, he would not be experiencing this great grief. Then again, if he had died as an infant, he would have never grew up to experience the joys of life. Note the first part of the book of Job, chapter 1, with his wife and his sons and daughters and with his possessions. Think of the times of joy that he had with his children. He prayed for his children. He gave burnt offerings for his children. If he was never born, he would never have had them. And so he never would have had the joys that he felt. But now in his time of pain and grief, he's saying that if I was simply stillborn, if I had never saw the light of this world, then I would never have felt this way, this pain. Verse 17. There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. Yes, again, from the perspective of the world, that with death there is a rest. And what Job knew, he knew little of the afterlife. But from the perspective of the world, when they died, they were at rest. Verse 17, he says, there the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. And so he saw death as a place where the wicked cease from troubling others. And so if the wicked die, then they stop troubling people here in this world. He also saw death as a place where the weary, those weary of strength, those who are exhausted of strength, are at rest. Verse 18. There the prisoners rest together. They do not hear the voice of the oppressor. Verse 18, he says that in death, the prisoners rest together. It is there in death that captives are at ease, not hearing the voice of the oppressor who cruelly mistreated them in life. And so the idea here of being oppressed, verse 19, he says, the small and the great are there, and the servant is free from his master. The small and great are both there in death, the great equalizer. This includes the servant and his master. It includes too the poor and the rich. The servant is also free from his master in death. And so Job asks some why questions during his time of suffering. Why? Third, we see the mystery of misery in verses 20 to 26. Verse 20, we see in verses 20 to 22 a long sentence. Job asks why life is given to the miserable. Verse 20, why is life given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter of soul? Job uses light and life interchangeably for the light of life. He asks why light is given to him who was suffering in misery rather than being given darkness. He also asks why life is given to him who is in bitterness rather than in death. So the idea of misery or suffering. Verse 21, who long for death, but it does not come, and search for it more than hidden treasures. Why is life, he said, given to them who long for death? The term long in this passage is literally wait. And so despite longing or waiting, death does not come. They search for death more eagerly than for hidden treasures. And despite searching, they do not find death. Death is not found. This word search may also be rendered as dig, such as in Job 11:18, and some versions read dig in this passage. It says, and search for it or dig for it more than hidden treasures. However, while one digs for treasure, search seems to be more preferable in this passage, such as to search or look or to seek death rather than to dig for death. But here we have this longing and this searching for death, but it does not come. Verse 22, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they can find the grave. And so they long for death. Verse 21, they rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they finally die, when they finally find the grave. It's difficult to imagine how great the grief is of Job, so that he so longed for death. However, it is noteworthy that Job, who suffered as great as he did, with the loss of possessions and family and his health, along with companionship of others, how that as great as he suffered, he never mentions contemplating suicide or taking his own life as a way of finding death. He never did. Verse 23. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? Job was at a very low point in his life. Job asked, why is light given to him who is in misery? Verse 20. He now says, why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? He felt as though his way was hidden or concealed. He felt as though he was hedged in by God. A similar passage is found in Job 19:8, where Job said, he has fenced up my ways so that I cannot pass, and he has set darkness in my paths. Earlier in the book of Job, Satan said how the Lord made a hedge around Job in Job 1 and 10. In that passage, he was talking about a hedge of protection. He mentions the great blessings of the Lord. No wonder Job serves you, Lord, considering you have made a hedge about him, considering how much you have blessed him. And so that was the argument of Satan, the adversary, the accuser. Now in this passage, Job asks why light or life is given to a man whose way is concealed or hidden and whom God has hedged in. And so he is surrounded with misery. Here we see that the translator adds the words for clarity, why is light given? And they're added appropriately. We can see from verse 20, why is light given? He continues that thought here in verse 23, to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in, Job said in his grief. Job did not curse God. He cursed his birth. He wished for death, but he did not curse God. And he said some things that were wrong, and he said some things that were harsh. We can be understanding given his great suffering, and still recognize that at times Job sinned. Job was a blameless man, but he was not a sinless man. He was a man of integrity, but he certainly wasn't sinlessly perfect. He was a man of great patience. But we do see how that this affliction had took a great toll upon him. And yet he continues to believe in God. Verse 24. For my sighings come before I eat, and my groanings pour out like water. Job expresses the greatness of his misery. Sometimes, as we study the book of Job, some passages are more difficult than others. In this particular passage, there is some difficulty. However, the main point is that he's expressing his great misery, his sighing, his groaning. First, he says, for my sighing comes before I eat. I eat may be literally translated as my bread. And so my sighing comes before my bread. This may mean that his sighing came before or instead of his bread. His misery no doubt ruined his appetite. We see from a later passage in Job 6:7, my soul refuses to touch them. They are loathsome food to me. And in other passages, we see passages indicating how that he lost considerable weight. Verse 25. For the thing I greatly feared has come upon me, and what I dreaded has happened to me. As trouble had come, he feared that more trouble would come upon him. Sure enough, what he dreaded happened. would happen happened just as he feared. Verse 26, I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, for trouble comes. He did not feel at ease. He was not quiet or at peace. He could not rest. He could not rest knowing that trouble would continue to come upon him. Job 3 and verse 13. What torment we see upon this man. What patience and integrity and faith in God. What a lesson for us today to learn from the book of Job. Next time, Lord willing, we'll continue this dialogue between Job and his friends. And we'll look at the first speech of one of his friends in the next lesson. Thank you for being here today, and Lord willing, we'll see you in that lesson.